Hi, welcome to the Covenant Living Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Pavlantos.
And I'm Ryan Hartman. Thank you for joining us as we explore the Hebraic roots of Scripture.
Through rich teaching and our conversation, we hope to uncover the Bible's original context, meaning its history, its language, and its culture, to bring clarity and depth to God's Word.
Whether you're new to the faith or a seasoned believer, we hope that this episode challenges you to walk closer with Yeshua. When you think of the word discipline, do you think of an angry parent punishing their child? Or do you think of a parent who is just trying to train and discipline their child to become a better person? Today, when we look at Hebrews chapters 11 and 12, we're going to find out how God views discipline and why it's important for us.
Hi, welcome to Covenant Living. I'm Stephanie with my co-host and co-pastor, Ryan. Thanks for being with us. And if you have enjoyed our podcast, I encourage you to share, comment, and subscribe. We hope that you are learning something from what we have been presenting each week. And so let me just catch you up to where we are today. So we're going to be in Hebrews 11, starting in verse 23. We did the first 22 verses, and basically it's all about faith. And we saw different Old Testament people. We saw the definition at the very beginning of what faith is. And then we talked about those people. But I don't want to go into all of that. So let me just give you a really brief overview. So Oswald Chambers said, faith is deliberate confidence in the character of God, whose ways you may not understand at the time. And that's very true. So we don't always understand what God is doing, but we have faith in him and we stand firm on our faith. Faith is what sets us apart from everybody else. And we ended actually with just the verse that talked about that God was not ashamed to call them his children. He's not ashamed of us. He's not ashamed to call us his children, because even if we fall, even if we mess up and we come back, he's not ashamed of the things that we do, because he knows us and he understands us. He knows our hearts. He knows our minds. He knows what triggers us. He knows what keeps us from growing. He knows all these things about us, and yet he's not ashamed. And that's the good news of this chapter. So we're going to go from here. We're going to start in verse 23 and finish chapter 11 and get into chapter 12 today.
All right, well, I'm going to start reading in chapter 11, verse 23 then, and I'm going to read all the way through verse 27, and it says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible."
Great verses here. And of course, it starts out with Moses. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail about this, but I think it's interesting because the author of Hebrews gives a little bit more detail about these men of the Bible that maybe it didn't say in the Old Testament. And here it actually says that his parents were not afraid of the king. And of course, the king or the Pharaoh's edict was that all babies under 2 needs to be thrown into the Red Sea. So, or killed. So they weren't afraid of that, and they hid him. But I think the verses that Ryan and I want to concentrate on in this passage right here is 26 and 27, because there's 2 lines here that suddenly throw Yeshua into the mix of what was happening in Exodus. And it says in 26, he considered the reproach of Christ, or we could say he valued the disgrace for Christ. That's actually how it is in the Greek lexicon, was greater than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking forward to the reward or his reward. And then 27 also mentions something interesting. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured seeing him who is invisible. So who's he talking about there? Obviously, it's the Father. He's the invisible one. So I think there were very interesting verses there, and I think they stand out that we need to talk about them. So when we are talking, so where do we see Yeshua in Exodus? And Ryan and I were talking about that before we started recording, because Ryan was like, why is he bringing this up here, kind of thing. So go ahead and say what you were saying, and then I'll go back to Exodus and read a couple verses.
Well, I think when we look at that passage in Hebrews and it references the reproach of Christ, just the idea that the author of Hebrews is saying that, Moses was cognizant of Christ. It causes you to stop and like, wait, time out. And then you start thinking, okay, so he must be equating the angel of the Lord in the burning bush, in the pillar of cloud, and all of that. But what gets me is just that it's sort of just flowing out of this author of Hebrews, writing to the Hebrew believers. And what that tells me is that the Hebrew believers already understood that one, Jesus, Yeshua, is the invisible God. And that is something that's sort of astonishing, because you hear like, the early church, they didn't necessarily view Jesus as divine and all of that.
Yeah.
But here the author of Hebrews, the way he's handling this, the way he's using this language and handling these verses, it becomes clear that it was commonly understood and believed that Jesus is God, and that he was obviously portrayed in some of these Old Testament passages.
And yeah, and I mean, at this point, he was an agent. He was standing in God's place, in a sense, and speaking for God. There are others, obviously, there are people out there who see him just as an agent of God, not necessarily God. We happen to believe that they are one, and three parts, one tree, three branches, kind of thing. But I think it's interesting in verse 24 and even the end of 23, the very end of 23, and I'm in Exodus 23. It says, behold, I send an angel or a messenger before you to stand guard. He said in 21, be careful to pay attention to him. Do not rebel, for he will not pardon your transgression. So obviously this is not just any old angel, because he has the power to pardon transgression. For my name is in him. And then he says, be careful to obey his voice and do all that I say. And then in 24, again, near about verse 9 and on, he goes, they go up, the 70 elders of Israel, Moses, Aaron, they all go up, and they saw the God of Israel, there in verse 10. And there under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he, meaning the God of Israel, did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God. So he didn't kill us. He didn't kill them for being there and seeing, because it says they saw the God of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. So all of these is what we normally think of seeing Yeshua. They see the Son of God. Who are they interacting with? And who are they seeing? The Son of God. So he is standing in for the Father and speaking as the Father. And I think it's interesting because we both have taught, like, seeing Yeshua in Old Testament. And this is one of the biggest places that we see Yeshua in the Old Testament. So, yeah. So, like you said, they understood it in Hebrews. The author there understands that he's like doing this for the Son of God.
Yeah. And maybe someday, maybe in our next podcast, we could actually dive into some of those concepts of, Yeshua, Jesus in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And how that matters, because this author is bringing in things that were obviously common knowledge to the first century church in terms of who Jesus is, who God is,
Right.
and how he reveals himself. But the church doesn't necessarily always teach that from the pulpit in modern Christianity.
Right.
But one of the things I would like to just bring back, because we introduced this idea last week, was this idea is that when we're under persecution, or in some sort of time of difficulty, this is where that faith really begins to manifest. And so here it's saying that, Moses, when he's dealing with potential for persecution or actual persecution, he's not ashamed. He doesn't like despise this angel of the Lord, or, this, this angel that's enthroned that they're having a covenant meal with on Mount Sinai, God Jehovah, where they're eating a meal with him. He's not going to be embarrassed of who God is, just to make himself look good or in some way be approved by the king. And I think that is one of the big things that we do in our faith, is that sometimes we have a greater fear of men than a fear of God.
Right.
But that's all I would say about that.
Okay. So we'll move on. I'll start in 28 and go to 31. So let me pull it up here. By faith, Moses kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. I think that's where we're going to stop.
Well, in these verses, and again, as we talked about last week, faith is an action. And so when I think of faith, I think of Luke chapter 6, verse 46. And Jesus asks this question. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you?" And in this chapter 11, what you're seeing is a bunch of people who are actually doing what God told them to do. Moses being obedient to the God that he met on Mount Sinai. Abel being obedient, making offerings that were pleasing to the Lord. Well, why would he be making offerings unless he had received some instructions about making offerings? Like, how do you do it? Abel is doing what God told him to do and how to do it. He wasn't making stuff up as he was going. And so I think that when we read these verses about Moses and others, all the way up to the story of Jericho with Rahab and all that, it's people who are, number one, there's a fear of the Lord, but there's also an uncompromising obedience to the Lord, doing the Lord's will. And I think that's really what it boils down to. All these verses in Hebrews 11, that's what they're kind of boiling down to at this point. So that's all I would say on that. Would you like to comment, or would you like me to move forward?
Go ahead and read on. We're good.
Okay. So
30.
in verse 32, I think is where we're at.
Mhm.
It says, and what more shall I say? For time would not, time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment.
This is a pretty cool list of people, but an amazing list as in what happened. There are some pretty powerful men here. You know, we don't think of Gideon as being very powerful, but God raised him up. He went off the deep end, got into stuff he shouldn't have, but he defeated an army with 300 men. Samson, of course, you know the story, David, Samuel, the other prophets. It's really interesting how they're described here. They stopped the mouths of lions, they quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, and were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put armies to flight. And I think that what he's saying here is look at all that these men have been doing. And it was their, like we've been saying, it was their faith in God that made them strong, gave them the power to do exactly what God wanted them to do. And I think when I read that or hear it even read, I think in a sense, like, what could I do with that kind of faith? What could any one of us do with that kind of faith? Put armies to, we're not all called to do that. We're not all called to do certain things, but it's not, I guess I'm saying but it's not impossible either. There may be one time in our life that we are called to do something really mighty and we do it. And then God doesn't call on us again to do something like that. I remember when I was in a church, we were in that church for 10 years and I heard the Lord talk and I would hear him speak to me, say, go pray over this room. There's a demonic force going on in here and you need to tell it to leave. I mean, I was just like, why me? I wouldn't get, really? Me? You want me to do that? Why don't you asking the pastor to do that? But the Lord would say, no, you. And so for that season, he would call on me to do things like that were really like out of my wheelhouse, so to speak, I felt. But then when we ended up moving on, when the Lord led us to a new church, he was silent. I didn't do anything like that ever again. From that time, I've not done anything in that sense the same way. I haven't done those things that he called me to do. He would call me to tell this woman such and such. He would give me words to tell this woman. And one time he told me to go to the pastor and tell the pastor that Satan desired to have this church. I'm like, you want me to tell the pastor that? Those kinds of things that were just totally out of my comfort zone. And I think this is what these men, what we're talking about here, it may have not been a normal way of life for them, but there were times when they stepped up and they did powerful things in the name of their God because he called them and he gave them the power and the authority to carry that out. And they did it because of their faith. And I think any one of us could do those same things. Sorry, we're having a little bit of problems with my internet. So if this jumps around, you'll know why. That's what I read when I see that. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly, right. And I think that's good advice where we read these stories about Daniel in the lion's den and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And we think, oh man, why isn't my life like that? Think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's like fiery furnace.
Yeah.
and maybe a couple of other references. You're literally talking about a couple of days of their entire life. They had to be superstars, and they were. Okay, we're not talking, it's not like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were perfect for like 75 straight years and never lacked faith or anything. What the Bible's trying to show you, it's not telling you that these people were perfect. It's saying, look at when they were doing the right things. This is what it looks like.
Mhm.
And so when, as you mentioned, when you come to this moment when God is asking you to leave your comfort zone and do something extraordinary, we can draw from those stories and say, hey, you know what? I have the same faith. I have the same Lord. I am more than able to do these things because just as he worked through them, he can work through me. So I think that you're exactly right. And that's, really good stuff.
Yeah.
You want to move on?
Yeah. So 37. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect.
It's amazing. This author is not just going through what we have today as the Hebrew canon of the Old Testament. This author is actually going beyond that. He's referring to in verse 37 where it says that they were sawn in two. That is obviously a reference to the ascension of Isaiah, which is a book that was not included in the Old Testament, but obviously it was regarded as authoritative to this author because he's actually referencing that Isaiah was, you know, hiding from King Manasseh, and he hid inside of a hollowed out tree, and King Manasseh knew that he was hiding there, and so he commanded that the tree be cut down with Isaiah hiding in it. Uh, and so you have all these stories that aren't actually in the Bible, but he's referencing them as if they actually happened. And so there's probably a good chance that some of those stories are absolutely true that we don't actually have in our Bible, but are in what we would call the Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha. Some of these accounts are actually probably true. And then he even references some of these, like the people at Qumran who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, who were living in caves. Talks about how their faithfulness was an example to everybody. But the passage that I love here is that it's talking about all these people and how they were afflicted and mistreated and how they never wavered in their faith. And it says in verse 38, it says, of whom the world was not worthy.
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, when the whole world was unfaithful.
Yeah. And that kind of
These,
choked me up when I read it. It kind of started to choke me up. I was like, oh, how to push it down.
yeah, it's like these these people are keeping their faith. They're staying true to their Lord, even when the world is burning down around them and everybody else is faltering and failing. These people are preserving the revelation that God gave to the Hebrew people. And it is so inspiring. But then it goes through and it says all these people were commended for their faith, but they didn't receive what was promised. And so the overarching promise, as I understand it, is ultimately that we're going to be restored to the Garden of Eden. So this restored Eden is a big deal for the believer, and it should be a big deal for us too, because this is the overarching promise that we're going to, in resurrection bodies, return to Eden. And so the glory that Adam and Eve had when they were created is going to be restored to us. And that's the promise, I think, that is being referred to, that all these people of faith, they died, they went, they're in heaven. And all these people are what we're going to see are a great cloud of witnesses. In other words, they don't have this resurrection body. Okay. We're all going to get to go to Eden together. This is the promise. We're all going to be in bodies like Adam and Eve, glorified bodies. And we're all going to enter Eden together. Nobody gets to go like way ahead of time. We all get to spend the same amount of time. And so I think that that's the promise. All these people died in faith and they're being preserved. They become what we're going to read as part of this great cloud of witnesses. And they're waiting for all of us because we're going to be part of that great company of witnesses because of our faith and faithfulness. And so then one day at the resurrection, we're all going to enter Eden together. That's at least how I take it.
So we're ready to get into chapter 10, 11 or 12, whatever we are. Oh,
Yeah.
God, starting chapter 12. But 11 is a great chapter. So I think that when 12 starts with therefore, it's obviously referring back to what's going on in 11. And especially what you just said there about verses 39 and 40.
I'm going to read these first two, and
Yep.
you can
That's
go
right.
from there. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God.
Yeah. So therefore, we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. So all these people that have gone before us, all these people from the Old Testament that he's been talking about, they're the cloud of witnesses. They're witnessing what the Messiah has done for us. Because remember, they didn't experience the blood of the Lamb. They knew what was coming, but they didn't experience Yeshua and his redemption the way that we have been exposed to since he was on this earth. So they're the great cloud of witnesses. And he says, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance. So we see this word endurance a few times, actually. It says there in verse 1, endurance, the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, founder and perfecter of our faith, was a very popular verse, a well-known verse. For the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. And so we see that we're not running, and I think we've mentioned this before. I don't know where I heard it recently, but we're not running a race in the sense of a sprint. We are running a marathon. It's enduring. It's going at a pace that we can endure things, and we are keeping up. We're not trying to get out ahead of everybody. We're just going and keeping pace with Messiah. We're walking with him. And that's like what they're witnessing. I think it's really cool to think of it that way. I don't know that they can see down from heaven and see what we're doing, but they're on some level, they're the witnesses. They've done it all. They've been there, done that, but now they're witnessing the power of Jesus' blood. And but this is the race that's set before us. We're looking to, of course, Yeshua, for Jesus, our founder and perfecter of our faith. And I think that's encouraging. That should be encouraging to all of us, because he is the perfecter of our faith. We don't perfect our faith. It's him who perfects our faith. And this happens as we're going to open up into the rest parts of 12 through things that God puts into place. So he perfects our faith through spiritual warfare. through discipline, through challenges, through tribulation. All of these things perfect our faith if we stand firm, like Ephesians says, stand firm. And I think that's what he's setting the stage for. Like the things that's coming, the discipline, the things that happen. And sometimes, and Brian and I were even talking about, a lot of times we mistake discipline for spiritual warfare. So we start casting and binding and rebuking Satan, and the Lord's up there like, no, it's me. I'm doing this, trying to teach you something. But even Yeshua allowed this to happen to him. We've read in the other chapters of Hebrews, he became obedient to the cross. He became obedient to the Lord, doing what the Lord wanted him to. He was our example. But he did it, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. So he knew what was on the other side of that cross. And I think it's interesting because when you're actually in Jerusalem, when you are at the place where the garden of Gethsemane is, you can see the western gates, like where they would have been, the western wall. You can actually see the western wall from there. And then on the other side of the western wall was where the cross was. And I think it's really cool because someone pointed out when we were there, look what he could see when he was praying, your will, not mine. He could see the western wall, which he will enter someday when he returns. So it's a beautiful picture.
So do you want to read on?
Sure.
Start in verse 3.
Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines those he loves and chastises every son whom he.
So these verses, they're really bringing us into this idea of the Lord's discipline. And, Yeshua had to actually endure all the way through, obviously a brutal, torturous death. And he remained faithful. And the author is saying, hey, we haven't resisted to that extent.
Right.
Generally speaking. Now, some had. By the time of this writing, of course, Stephen had been martyred. James, the brother of John, had been martyred. And this is probably right around the time when James the Just, the half-brother of Jesus, would have been martyred. So most people, though, hadn't they hadn't been like beaten up and all of that, or flogged, and certainly not murdered for their faith. So he's saying, hey, it's not that bad. Stay strong. Look at Jesus. He continued through an unbelievable death and martyrdom. So certainly you can do it too. You have the same Holy Spirit that Yeshua had. So he reminds the people, though, that they are sons. And this harkens back to Romans chapter 8, where we're referred to as being adopted as the sons of God. And so, God disciplines his sons and daughters, but when of course, when it says sons, it means daughters as well. But he does this disciplining because we're going to be heirs. We're going to be joint heirs with Yeshua. And God doesn't want us handling his things and governing his things and being put in authority over his kingdom when we're acting according to our own will. his discipline is so that we will act according to his will and act according to his likeness and act in his image. As we were created, Adam, it says, was created in the image of God. Why? Because Adam was to have dominion over the earth, and Adam couldn't possibly rule over the earth unless he had God's heart, unless he was going to do God's will. And so, because, we are regarded as sons, and so we need that discipline so we can be conformed to the image of Yeshua, the Son of God, but also be the imagers of God himself, the creator. And so that's what all this is about. This isn't about God being sort of some heavy-handed guy that's like, cracking the whip. Hey, you're not doing this right and this right. It, it's not about God being sort of OCD about us being perfect. It's about God saying, hey, listen, you're going to have a lot of responsibility in the future. You have a lot of responsibility right now as my sons and daughters representing my kingdom. You're going to have even more after the resurrection where you're going to rule and reign. So I need you to be just like me. That's why discipline is happening. And that's how I would kind of regard that. And the last verse talks about how the Lord disciplines the one whom he loves. Okay. Again, that language of the one whom he loves, that's covenant language. Okay. So God is not out there disciplining sinners and people who have rejected him, people who aren't in covenant with him. When things happen to them, it's like the consequences of their own sin. But oftentimes when things happen to us, it's because God is in covenant with us. And he's like, hey, listen, I'm not going to let you fail. You're my son. I'm going to make you become the person I need you to be. And so in those times of discipline, that's where we need to have a submissive heart and say, yes, Lord, let your will be done in my life.
That's very good. And we'll talk about it a little bit more in the next section too.
I will start reading verse 7, I think, verses 7 through 11.
Yes.
It says, it is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But he disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields a peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it.
Yeah. So this introduces discipline there in the Proverbs 3:11 that I read right before in actually parts of 5 and 6. And let me just read to you the word here. It's musar, musar, and it is chastisement, reproof, warning, instruction. And so basically it has the feeling of even rebuke, correction. It's all of that. And I know this is, we were talking about this ahead of time, and Ryan and I were talking about what discipline means to us. And if you had like a parent who was a little, maybe had anger issues, and you felt like you were really abused, because there are people who are abused by their parents. And so this can be a real trigger when the Lord then disciplines you, and it's painful, or it's not easy to go through, because he does discipline us in this life. And I always tell people, I feel like he disciplines us in this life so that he doesn't have to punish us for eternity. So we can take the discipline here, but the idea is just Ryan had said earlier, it's disciplining as a good father who shows restraint. He's not going off the deep end and taking out his anger on us. He shows self-control. He has restraint on how he disciplines us. But sometimes it's still not good. And we think of Paul and the thorn in the flesh that he had. That was actually, it wasn't spiritual warfare. It was from God himself. He said, I did this because of the level of knowledge that he had. It was to keep him humble. So sometimes the Lord, that's part of discipline. It's to keep us humble because God doesn't like us being arrogant and a know-it-all. So he will cause things to keep us humble. There's different reasons things happen to us, but some of them are out of discipline. Some of them are just because the world is fallen and it's sinful. Why do good people have terrible things happen? Why are people victimized and having terrible things happen to them? It's because we live in an evil world, but it doesn't mean that God enjoys it. So that's not discipline. That's just evil. That's just sin. So I wanted to just read that verse, that definition of discipline, because when he disciplines us, it says he's treating us as sons. So if we're never disciplined, then he's not considering you a son or a daughter. So think about it that way. There was something else I read in there that I wanted to bring out, and it says there in 10, he disciplines us for our good, so we will share in his holiness. I was telling Ryan this story, but my youngest, when he was 4, he did something really minor. He took food off his sister's plate and ate it. And I go, that's not right. You don't do that. You don't eat your sister's food. And I'll give you more, that whole thing. So I said, go sit on the step in a timeout. And he refused. And it escalated. It's stood him down, putting him down. And he just stands right back up and runs away. So then it's, okay, you want to stand? Let's stand in a corner. So then now I'm having to hold him in the corner because he runs away every time I put him in the corner. So it just escalated to the point that now I'm crying and upset because the kid won't do what I say. And it's, So my husband being a strong-willed man, I call him at work and I'm like, what do I do? And he goes, he's strong-willed. You need to really let him know that you're boss. And he needs to actually cry, not just yell out of anger because he doesn't like your discipline, but he needs to cry. So I knew exactly, he told me exactly what to do, and I did it. And he turns around with tears, and then his whole demeanor changed because this is a picture of who we are. We can reject God's discipline. We can despise his discipline, but then the discipline has to escalate every time we despise it. It has to escalate. It has to get firmer. He has to get firmer with us. And this verse came to mind in Job 5:17. It says, blessed is the one whom God disciplines or reproves. Therefore, despise not the discipline of the Almighty. So I think that's the lesson for me in this. It's don't despise his discipline because he disciplines those he loves and considers sons. And that's the good news. So
sometimes I think it can be difficult to discern what is God's discipline. Something is happening in my life, say for example, that is very uncomfortable, very difficult to get through. How do I know if that's God's discipline? Or how do I know if it's just like, hey, I made a bad decision and now I'm dealing with the consequences?
Right.
How can we possibly, sometimes the Lord, and I guess what this boils down to is relationship. We have to be in prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to, when we're going through these times of difficulty, I think we need to be have this close relationship where the Lord is saying, hey, listen, I'm allowing this to happen so that this gets worked out in you. Or hey, no, this isn't you, this isn't me here. You need to deal with this because you made a bad decision and now you got to deal with it.
Yeah.
This isn't coming from me, I think our relationship with God must be so intimate, like you and your son, you know, it has to be like that so that we can know and not become like frustrated and angry and bitter. Like, why is God treating me like this? Well, it might not be God that's allowing a circumstance in your life. It might be your own bad decision. So it's really important to be in prayer and to have this intimate relationship with the Lord so that we know when we're being disciplined by him. And by the same token, we also know when, you know, we've stepped into, we've made a bad decision and now we're just dealing with the world coming at us because of our foolish mistake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good
So,
point. Yeah, we need to be discerning, and that requires prayer.
yeah.
So, and I think that's all that we have time for today. So we'll have to start in verse 12 next week and finish up chapter 12. And we should be able to do that easily. But this was a good chapter and a difficult one, depending on what kind of discipline you've had to endure in your life.
Nobody likes discipline.
Mm-mm.
You
Nobody.
nobody enjoys it. It's not comfortable, but I really think that the mature believer welcomes it. And it takes
A correction.
it takes a long time. And it takes a heart that is like, I want to be like Yeshua. I want to be a new creation.
Yeah.
It really takes that sort of person. Otherwise, you will be, like God tells Paul, the Apostle Paul, Paul or Saul, why are you kicking against the goads? Why are you fighting me? Why are you persecuting me? You know, I think that a lot of believers, sometimes we're fighting against God
Mm-hmm.
and
And we don't even know
and
it.
and we don't even know it. And it can become just this circle and cycle of frustration.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that part of maturity is coming to a point where it's like, okay, Lord, you need to peel back the layers of flesh that I've been living in so that I can become more like Yeshua.
Yes.
So I think that's a big step in the process of um, holiness and sanctification.
Yes. Amen. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next week. Shalom.
Shalom.